All right, my friend. So when we talk about the American Revolution and events that happened from Britain, we really need to understand King George III, right? Parliament is under the control of the King of England. The King of England is the magistrate over the colonies, and his desire to control the colonies. We have to kind of learn a little bit about him. So, in the read and do section of the reading, you have this chart. So, we're going to go through it and come up with the words and phrases to describe King George. And it kind of helps us understand him and why he just won't let the colonies go. All right, so I'm actually going to make this a little smaller. All right, so King George III took his throne in Great Britain in 1760. Within a few years, tensions between Great Britain and the colonists began to grow. His personality traits and attitude increased tensions. How did the king's point of view contribute to the break between his country and the American colonies, right? So his idea to want to hold on to them leads to the reason of wanting to control them, sending more troops, taxing them, etc. In 1748, a 10-year-old British boy named George acted in a play. He took the role of the noble hero Cato in the play. The ruler of Cato's country had become a tyrant. A tyrant is like a not a kind ruler. He had stopped listening to the people and had begun to behave as a dictator, right? Someone who's just controlling and not letting anyone speak for themselves. But Cato believed deeply in the people's rights to freedom. Rather than give in to a tyrant, Cato chose to fight and die. An hour of liberty, he says, is worth a whole eternity in bondage. The play was popular in Great Britain at the time, and many people agreed with its ideas about liberty. Young George also believed in these ideas. He knew that he would one day be the king of Great Britain, which would give him great power and influence. But he believed that he must use his power for the good of the country. He realized that it would be his job to ensure the freedom and well-being of his people. The young man took his duties very seriously. At this time, becoming king might have seemed in the far distance because distance to future Prince George. His grandfather, George II, sat on the royal throne. His father, Prince Frederick, was next in line to be the King of Britain. Prince Frederick was just 41 years old, and it appeared likely that George would have to wait many years before king, right? So he had his grandfather, then it would be his father, and then it would be his turn once his father passed. But George's time to rule Great Britain arrived much sooner than he expected. In 1751, Prince Frederick died unexpectedly. At only 12 years old, George was now next in line for the throne. For the next several years, George prepared himself to rule his kingdom by educating himself. He studied languages, math, science, and other subjects. Prince George worked hard to prepare himself to be a good king so that he could be worthy ruler of his people. In short, he was very tough on himself, and while the young prince looked forward to becoming king, he was also painfully aware of his own failings, meaning his own self inabilities, his own insecurities. The young prince was also very hard on others and quick to judge people's behavior. He often reacted badly to criticism and took it personally. He stubbornly held on to grudges against those who had insulted him or his family. Now, before he becomes king, let's write down some of these traits that we've found out about King George III already. Okay, so we know that he has a big, strong personality. He was a hard worker. He studied hard, also well educated. He was stubborn. He held firm to his opinions, didn't want to budge. Typical prince, if you want to think, that kind of goes with his strong personality. And he was reactive to judgment and criticism, right? So if someone judged him, he couldn't handle an insult because he was stubborn about his own the way he felt. And also reactive because he was probably insecure with some of his feelings. Prince George's personal traits were probably not unusual for a young person, but Prince George was not just any kind of young man. For in 1760, his grandfather, King George II, died. Now Prince George was king and ruler of Great Britain at the age of 22, so he became king at a young age. He had to lead the most powerful country in the world, and more important, he had to learn to deal with those who opposed him. Challenges came from within Great Britain as the 1760s wore on. Challenges also came from across the ocean. The colonies in North America were growing increasingly dissatisfied with how Great Britain was treating them. In 1760, the young king was ready to begin his new duties. In his first speech from the throne, he declared, "I glory take pride in the name of Britain. His greatest satisfaction, he said, was to serve the people. It was their love and support that would protect him. The public seemed to welcome this patriotic new king. But Parliament felt otherwise about the new king. King George had hoped to be able to work with all the members of Parliament, but many of the members did not want to work with the king. They did not like his ideas and thought that government worked best when Parliament was not under the king's control. There was also worry that King George wanted too much power. So his another problem is that he had conflicts with Parliament, right? So that's a big issue. King George's strong personality began to cause trouble. The king believed deeply in doing what he thought was right and therefore held firmly to his ideas. He was very critical of those who did not agree with him and found it difficult to work compromises. So he could not compromise. I'll put that here with his criticism, or maybe we'll put it here. Could not compromise. His rigid attitude created many enemies in the government. He considered opposing ideas and criticism to be a personal attack against him. One member of parliament noted that the king was capable of great resentment and of holding on to it, right? He held on to a grudge. The king's personality also caused problems with the American colonies. During the 1760s, relations between Great Britain and the colonies became tense. As the conflict grew, the king would not even consider changing his views. He refused to listen to the colonists' concerns and frustrations. He did not believe that they had any right to protest against his actions, right? They had no right to protest against his actions. They had to be submissive. They had to follow his rule. He felt that their complaints were an insult to him, and he saw no merit in their point of view. At first, the colonists hoped that they could persuade the king and be reasonable. After all, they had succeeded in persuading King George and his government to repeal the Stamp Act. In New York, the colonists even built a statue to thank the king for repealing several taxes in 1770. However, the king had his own reasons for the dropping the taxes, and that had little to do with the colonists' unhappiness. King George had realized that enforcing the taxes would be costly, so it made little sense to have taxes that lost money for the British government, meaning they would have to pay for tax collectors and the troops, which actually cost more than the money they were earning. George did not think that the British government was in any way wrong to tax the colonists. He did not agree with the colonists' angry protests against taxation without representation. Soon enough, Parliament created new taxes with George's full support. The king thought that this was fair and proper. Indeed, George believed that the colonists' demands were outrageous. The more the colonists acted out in protest, the angrier the King George became. Members of the government could see trouble coming. Some members even agreed with the American rebels and suggested that the king consider a compromise, right? So he could not compromise, even though Parliament was saying, listen to what they're saying. Members of his government could see the trouble coming. However, George refused. He felt that it was his duty to hold on to his nation's colonies. He was furious that the colonies dared to challenge his power, and this anger clouded the king's judgment. So he eventually just became so stubborn that he could just follow he needed to control them. King George III had set Great Britain on a collision course with the American colonies. He would never give in to them. The attitude would lead to a break between the colonies and his nation. There's some pictures of King George III. One of the most famous pictures of him in his royal garb, just showing his wealth, furs, etc. These are examples of the stamps that were taxed. All right, so on the back, nothing would be fun without a little song and dance, correct? So some of you should be familiar with the musical Hamilton. It's one of the best. This is for a little friend in my class who knows who she is. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen to the song You'll Be Back from the Broadway play Hamilton. And the lyrics are actually a nice summary of the chapter. And this is why I loved it. When I first saw Hamilton, I listened to the soundtrack and I was able to go see it. And I watched it on when Disney Plus picked it up. I was like, oh my God, this is a summary of what we just covered in one of our chapters in social studies. So for each of the lyrics, there is an event that we can summarize. So when he says, the price of my love is the price you're not willing to pay, what is he referring to, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to put the number on the side when we're listening to the song and think about the events that happened in this chapter. What is it referring to? Okay, so wherever there is a bold and a number, that means that we can put a note to an actual historical significance that the lyrics are focusing on. There's a reason why Lin-Manuel Miranda won a Tony, and granted, this was an entertaining, but a good chunk of it is based on history, right? Some of this is, elaborated for entertainment value. Not everything in Hamilton is exactly historically true, but there is a big chunk of it that is a nice summary of history. So we're going to play the song, and Jonathan Groff is the actor who actually plays Hamilton, or I'm sorry, that plays King George III in the Broadway play Hamilton, the original cast, and his performances are really funny throughout the play. He has these little summaries that show his point of view. So we'll listen to all of it first, and I'll play it, and then we'll go back and do the page.
You say the price of my love's not a price that you're willing to pay. You cry in your tea, which you heard in the sea when you see me go by. Why so sad? Remember we made an arrangement when you went away. Now you're making me mad. Remember, despite our estrangement, I'm your man. You'll be back, soon you'll see. You remember you belong to me. You'll be back, time will tell. You remember that I served you well. Oceans rise, empires fall. We have seen each other through it all. And when push comes to shove, I will send a fully armed battalion to remind you of my love. Da 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 da. You say our love is draining and you can't go home. You'll be the one complaining when I am gone. And now don't change the subject, 'cause you're my favorite subject, my sweet submissive subject, my loyal royal subject, forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. You'll be back like before. I will fight the fight and win the war for your love, for your praise, and I'll love you till my dying days. When you're gone, I'll get mad, so don't throw away this thing we heard. 'Cause when push comes to shove, I will kill your friends and family to remind you of my love. Da 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 da
All right. So, unfortunately, I couldn't play for some reason. I couldn't record my screen from Disney Plus, so I couldn't share the actual video of it. So I found probably not a legal version of it, but it was pretty good. You heard the person recording it laughing in the background. All right. So let's look at our So let's look at our song, right? The price of my love is the price you're not willing to pay. So what's he referring to? The colonists didn't want to pay taxes to show their loyalty to Britain. All right, so if we look at our lyrics of our song. So the price of my love is the price you're not willing to pay. So the colonists didn't want to pay the taxes to show their loyalty to Britain. We made an arrangement when you went away. Oh no, I'm sorry. You cry in the tea which you hurled into the sea, right? So that's a reference to the Boston Tea Party. And then they're crying and they're upset because he closes the harbor, the intolerable acts. Um, we made an arrangement when you went away, right? That's from the chapter we just covered, chapter 7, right? The all the charters that were sent out to the colonies was that they can have this land, but they were under British rule. Number 4, you remember you belong to me. So the colonies are part of the British Empire. They're not their individual sovereign colonies. Empires fall. So this is a reference to the fact that the British Empire had fought against the Spanish, right? They brought down the Spanish Armada. They fought against the French in the French and Indian War, and they were also having their battles in Europe as well. So empires fall, and also kind of like a foreshadowing to the British Empire falling. When push comes to shove. So this is the force, right? The force of British troops, the intolerable acts, sending troops into Boston and New York, right? The larger colonial cities. Um, I will send a fully armed battalion to remind you of my love. Okay, that's the battalions. My love is draining, right? The fighting and the draining is draining resources and cost on both ends, right? The colonies are trying to find money from each other, and then it's costing Britain more money to send all these troops. You'll be the one who's complaining, right? That the colonies need the British protection, so they'll be upset when they don't have it anymore. Um, you're my favorite subject. Submissive. Submissive means you follow regardless. My loyal royal subject. So he wants the colony's approval. He wants them to follow him. He wants them to just, sit, be quiet, and do what I say. 11, I'll fight the fight and win the war, right? This is his stubbornness, no compromise on the taxes, no compromise on the acts. He won't give in. Number 12, I'll love you till my dying day. When you're gone, I'll go mad. So, this is a little foreshadowing piece about King George that was not in our reading. So, a little bit about King George in the later years. And we're going to get to this when we get into the American Revolution chapter. So, a lot of the policies about what happened during the American Revolution were from King George, right? Him not giving in. Now, he was reluctant to giving in to the end of the American Revolution and he kind of finally decided to give in, even 2 years or after the defeat of the Battle of Yorktown. But what happens is that he also goes through lapse of mental illness. So in 1778, he had a bit of violent insanity and he was restrained with a straitjacket. So 1778 is not too far away from where we're at in terms of it's about 2 years after the Declaration of Independence, 1778, and towards the end of the American Revolution. And he also, during that time, he starts to go to war with France, and that's Napoleon was in rule of France at that time, and Napoleon was taking over land. So he goes through. So it says he recovered, and then again he went through another bout of insanity right after the Battle of Waterloo. He died blind and deaf in 1820. So he had a lot of issues, but they eventually said that he slipped into, he was in and out of being able to handle it. And they always said, like, I'll go mad. That's where that lyric, I'll go mad, when you're gone, I'll go mad, right? When the colonies leave, his insanity and his mental health goes down the drain. I'll kill your friends and family to remind you of my love, right? King George III was a tyrannical ruler. That is how the colonists described him. The Declaration of Independence literally maps out the ways of how he's a tyrannical ruler, and he was ruthless in their fighting attacks, of how the British were fighting against the colonists and their militias. So anyone who wasn't loyal to the crown had to face the consequences of that, and that's where that lyric comes from. All right, my friends. So what we're going to work on next is mapping out all the events in this chapter into our timeline that we're going to work on for the next few chapters.